Hey Neil, very nice to meet you again.
Hey, Fabian, good to meet you too.
Before we kick things off, would you mind just giving us a little bit of context to who you are and what you've been doing over the past couple of years professionally?
Yeah, sure. My name is Neil Alliston. I grew up in the UK, originally studied engineering actually at Oxford and joined Shell's graduate scheme as an engineer. Spent a few years working in upstream oil and gas, decided it wasn't really the place for me and moved into the digital side of Shell's business. Primarily focused on what at the time the buzzword was machine learning for products within the mobility and logistics space. Um, did a few different product roles, product management, product leadership roles. I was briefly seconded out to a company called BCG, Boston Consulting Group, and then sort of decided that I wanted to move out of larger organization and join a startup. So I joined RAVIN AI, which is the company I work for now. And at the time, it was probably, about 5 people in the business. And the mission has always been to use AI and particularly a set of technologies broadly captured as computer vision to improve the efficiency of vehicle inspections. So in layman's terms, it's take pictures of cars and interpret those pictures to understand the condition of the cars. And depending on the use case, which I'm sure we can get into, it may be that within insurance, it's how do you make a claim process more efficiently? It may be within logistics, how do you assign liability if a vehicle is being transported? Or in the rental space. So if someone is checking out and checking in, how do you see if that vehicle is damaged and how do you assign it to the right driver so people aren't being incorrectly charged for the damage? So we've been going now for around 6, 7 years, founded in Europe, but about 4 years ago, I moved over to the US, which is where I'm based now, as our US business started to grow and expand. So my role is I lead the product team. I'm the head of product here at Raven, and also the head of the US business. So from a commercial perspective, I kind of double hat.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you so much for the overview. A really inspiring, interesting journey. A little bit off topic, but how did you find the transition from one of the, I guess, incumbents in sort of traditional oil and gas, even though they also do lots of sort of renewable stuff, a child to your current startup environment from a sort of cultural and ways of working standpoint?
Yeah. It's definitely an interesting transition. I think for me there was a bit more of a halfway step because within Shell, I was working in their what's called upstream oil and gas, which is really, producing and processing hydrocarbons. I then moved into their digital ventures team. So we had an office outside of the main Shell office. The culture was a bit closer to how you would, picture a startup would be. We had a lot of external people come in, particularly on the software engineering side, and on the data science side. So there was a bit of a transitional step for me there, which I guess made it a little bit easier. But the reality is, within any corporate environment, your role is kind of fairly safe and not really determined by the success or failure of that particular project that you're working on. So we would build new ventures, we would launch new startups, but the reality was, if they failed, you'd just be shuffled around somewhere else in the business. I think one of the big differences, at least mentally, moving into a real startup, as it were, is that the startup and your role and your job lives and dies based on the performance that you can deliver and you can manage a team to deliver. So I think it to some degree, like the biggest change is it feels a lot more real and has felt a lot more real, and the ups are much kind of higher, and the downs and the lows are much lower and scarier. But yeah, apart from that, I think the people we're working with, the technologies we're working on, are fairly similar to what we were working with within Shell's digital teams.
Fascinating. It seems to be like a very sort of recurring, I guess, trend that organizations like the incumbents in any industry try to sort of spin off these units, or at least culturally and organizationally disconnect them from many of these core business areas to sort of move quicker, fail faster, and are not necessarily bound to lots of these legacy systems. Maybe linking this to some of the current innovations in the wider automotive and mobility space. Do you think, especially as it relates to AI, Gen AI use cases, that this is something that we see or will see more in the future in terms of something that's developed sort of somewhat disconnected from the core of the business? Or do you think that there might be different ways to do that?
I think one thing that we learned at Shell, which I think is really relevant and at the core of your question, is to some degree you can move faster when you separate these teams, when you have these sort of separate innovation hubs. But the real question comes is when you are trying to put them back or trying to create value in the core business, sort of how disconnected and how separate is it? So to give you an example, I think the most successful projects that we had at Shell were ones that were driven by business needs from the core business. So it was about taking these modern technologies, which, frankly, most people were still working in Excel doing any modeling. And you bring in someone who has some background, even just in Python, even just someone who can automate some of this stuff. And it completely blows their mind that people are still typing in all these things and doing everything totally manually. But I think if that's too separate and if the culture is too different and if the problems you're working on are too far away from the core, then when it actually comes to making money and comes to scaling things, it becomes much harder. So the way I see it within big enterprises, big corporations, is the most effective use of their technology will be with teams that maybe they've pulled in skills externally, maybe they have experience outside of the business, so they can bring some fresh eyes, some fresh ways of doing things, some fresh energy to solving problems that haven't been solved before. But the problems need to be ones that are core to the business. And frankly, someone who works in a finance function in the corporation cares about, because otherwise they're not going to get the continued funding. They're not going to get the continued excitement about it once the hype sort of wears off and someone says, well, how do we actually scale this? I think the connection to the core is a really key point.
Building on that, one of the questions one of my team members asked me in our knowledge sharing yesterday is, Fabian, how is Gen AI changing your role as a product manager? And sort of, it's a question I would love to play back to you. How do you think some of these very recent tech developments are changing what you as a product person are or would need to do to unlock the most value from your products in a sustainable way?
Yes, super interesting. And there has been a lot of change. And I think people are still figuring out the power of these technologies. I think one thing I've learned is it's not a replacement for human thought, for human ingenuity, for human, prioritization. But I think, I really like the branding that Microsoft have used with this concept of a co-pilot. That feels like the best fit. So I'll come back to how I use it and how my team is using it. But just to give you, one of my, I guess, thoughts that I've been, thinking about for a while. I was giving a presentation at South by Southwest, the technology and business and film conference. And one of the questions that came up, there were obviously a lot of questions about Gen AI and what the future looks like. And I think the thesis that we sort of agreed on as part of the people who were presenting is what matters is ultimately the problems that are being solved or the opportunities that you have for improvement. It's going back to sort of the classical frameworks around jobs to be done. People don't just buy a technology. People have a problem that they want to solve or they have an opportunity they want to exploit. And what I think we'll see is increasingly over time, these technologies like Gen AI, like computer vision, will be less of a this is what this button does. It's kind of the AI button, and more just this is a feature within a tool that you're using. This is just a better way to do something that you're doing today. This is a more advanced way of communicating with an interface. So I think that's where we'll go, is the technology will be incorporated into tools and into software, probably ones you're using today, and we'll just make them better and make them more effective and more efficient. Putting that back to product management, I think there's a few different things. There's maybe the obvious ones around documentation, particularly when we're talking about language. What are some things that product managers work with a lot? They work with documents, they work with requirements, they work with customer interviews, research, insights, and the ability to quickly summarize, to quickly draw out kind of key things to focus on is a huge time saver. And similarly, I wouldn't recommend you use ChatGPT or Gemini to write any legal contracts, but I'm finding increasingly, the first time that I get some kind of document, I'll throw it in and just say, is there anything that I really need to focus on or anything surprising or unusual here? And like I say, that doesn't mean that you're not getting a lawyer to do final reviews, but I found I can speed up those cycle times significantly, and even make, if I'm writing something, some kind of contract or some kind of agreement with a customer, just slimming down some of the language, making it a bit more precise. I found that to be really helpful. On the other side of things, I think these tools can be really good brainstorming partners. I think, and you hear a lot about people who do write, or people who blog, or people like yourselves who have podcasts, who will sometimes just, throw in ideas and say, have I missed anything here? Are there any areas that maybe we're going through some kind of reorganization, or maybe we're going through some kind of performance review process. And I just want to think, rather than read 10 books on it, of which the knowledge can be, summarized in a few pages. I just want to see, what are the main things that I should be thinking about in creating this structure or in preparing for this thing. So yeah, and maybe those are the more obvious ones, but working with documents, summarizing knowledge, summarizing customer insight, helping, produce documents, found to be really helpful. And then as a brainstorming partner for decisions, or for, some creative thinking, I found that to be great. What I don't like is when the output has been clearly generated by a chatbot, by by some kind of interface. People use the term anodyne a lot. I think that works quite well. It's very formulaic. It all sounds the same. It all looks the same. So I think, yeah, those are some areas, and then maybe like a slightly more off the off the wall area is, creating presentations, sometimes creating visualizations to communicate a message. Sometimes I just find building a small image of something helps to get the point over, and now, you don't need an artist to do that, assuming you're not, creating it as part of your marketing material or whatever. So yeah, off the top of my head, those are some of the things that we found really helpful so far.
No, definitely seen way too many of these. Definitely ChatGPT generated LinkedIn posts recently. Too generic. So generally how I think about Gen AI in the context of my role is sort of twofold. And you've touched on the first category, which is essentially tools that help us do our job and our team's jobs more efficient and effectively, and code generation, testing, documentation, deployment, all of that. And then the second category is Gen AI tools that we develop as products themselves. I was just wondering, in sort of the second category, how you in your current organizational context think about potentially building advanced AI or Gen AI solutions in terms of the right fundamental approach in terms of how you deliver these products using an external solution, developing completely from scratch, fine-tuning an existing model. Is this something that you're currently thinking about? And if so, what are some of the associated questions in terms of how you land on the right sort of fundamental approach for a given problem?
Yeah, so we do build a lot in-house. We also use a lot of open source technologies. We rely less on third-party models, let's say it's like third-party commercial models, but that's not to say that we're not exploring how they can help support some of our existing models and technologies. I think to your question on, how do we think about this stuff, similarly to what I talked about with, tools and solving problems, it always starts from what are we trying to achieve here? It never starts, and we've made this mistake before on, hey, we have a technology, like let's throw a few things and see what happens. It always starts from what are our customers asking from us? What are we seeing in the data that we can improve? And is there a technology or a solution out there that can help us improve that, be it open source, be it third party, or be it something that we can build ourselves? Um, I think, a key element to what we do is you have to have some level of trust. Say it's a vehicle inspection. Say it's a vehicle on a production line. So the vehicle is being manufactured. There's some element of quality control at many different steps through that process. And you can't give just a sort of general sense, or you can't take a few data points and draw a conclusion in the same way that when you think about how language models are predicting words, or how, going back to how they originally were doing maths. And it was kind of like, take this number, and what does it sort of feel right to have the final number? They're not actually doing the calculation. It's just, the way I always think of the analogy I always think of is, it's kind of like you're just sort of thinking about something without thinking about it too hard. That doesn't work when you're trying to get operational efficiencies in a process where there is a yes or no answer, where there is there a defect on this vehicle? And if I have to stop the production line because I think there's a defect on this vehicle, I have to be pretty darn sure that there really is something there. Otherwise, I'm wasting people's time. So for us, maybe the big difference between more of a consumer product and what we're trying to do within the automotive space, within the industrial settings, is we're trying to make sure that our predictions are accurate and are helpful and aren't just a general sense of what needs to be done. So I'll give you a specific example. We work in insurance, and as part of the insurance claim process, we ask customers to take out their phone and to scan the damaged part of their vehicle. And then we process those images and we produce a triage recommendation to the insurance customer, to the insurance company. And that will say, is this a total loss vehicle? Is this a repair that's so small that it's not worth claiming for? Or is it something in between? Is there some kind of smart repair that can be done, or is it a complex repair? Now, we have tried taking those images and just throwing them into a GPT model, and it comes back with something that feels like it might be right, but when you actually put an automotive expert or an appraiser on it, it's just wrong enough that it wouldn't be helpful in the process. You know what I mean? And when you're dealing with insurance companies, when you're dealing with OEMs, like, they're not looking for something that just feels right. They're looking for something that is actually right. And I think that's where we have a technical challenge, but it's also where we have an opportunity. We're training around real data. We're not generalizing. We're being specific about the condition of the vehicle based on the actual vehicle. And we're trying to produce recommendations or suggestions that are factually accurate to a certain level of precision and accuracy, rather than produce a general sense of, well, what do we think is going on here.
First of all, thank you so much. That's really really helpful context. And both of these examples, they're very sort of clear and tangible to even someone who isn't necessarily working in this environment. How specifically did you, as far as you can talk about it, of course, did you approach the product development for both of these products from a sort of foundational model standpoint, and then how did you improve the model over time? What data assets did you use? How did you verify this with the customers and or users of your product, and sort of had this continued refinement loop until you got to this point of as you alluded to, sort of a solution that is good enough and can be used in a production or real world scenario.
Yeah, so we were, I guess, fairly lucky in that some of our first customers were in the rental space. And so you can imagine, big Avis budget group, those kind of people. And they would install camera systems at the check-in and check-outs of large airport locations. And those cameras would record video, and the video is then passed into lots of images. And that produces a huge amount of training data, like millions and millions of images. And it's images of actual cars actually driving in different weather conditions. When we think about computer vision in particular, you have to have seen cars from different angles. You have to have seen them in snow. You have to have seen them dark. You have to have seen them with dirt on them. And so, to some sense, we were very lucky that our initial use cases were able to produce a ton of data. And that data, we then have an in-house team of automotive professionals, people that have come out of the repair sector, have come from body shops, understand the condition of vehicles and damage on vehicles. And so what they do is they go over the AI's detections, go over the predictions, and refine the model. They provide feedback into the system. So that was our initial sort of training cycle. Once we got it to a level where we thought, hey, these are pretty happy with this. I think we can build a product around this. Then we started building some very lightweight products, which allowed us to visualize that information and allowed us to start showing it to customers. And of course, customers came back and said, we like this, but this absolutely needs to improve. And we just kind of kept going through those cycles. We use as much data as we can to understand how our predictions relate and have impacted our customers and how their sort of perception of accuracy. Now, one thing that's I'd say, maybe a subtlety here that you might not think of on first review is that there is some subjectivity involved in the condition of a vehicle. Like if you were to take your car in to 10 different repair shops and you had the same damage, then you would get different repair estimates and in some cases different repair methods. So with us, to some degree, it's harder because there's no ground truth, but there is an objective assessment from the customer. So they have their truth, but it's not necessarily the same as everyone else's truth. So we just have to try and do our best to make sure that our team are as closely aligned with the customers as possible to feed back into that training cycle.
No, thank you so much for that. Across these three examples that you mentioned, so the industrial operations case where you inspect vehicles that are being produced or roll off a production line, then the second use case around an individual that would like to make an insurance claim, and then the third example that you mentioned at a mobility sort of rental company that do sort of their final inspections when a customer would hand back a vehicle. They all seem to be quite. There are some commonalities around. We're all always talking about vehicles, which conditions need to be assessed to some degree, but generally these environments they're quite distinct. I was just wondering from your perspective as someone who is looking after a wide range of products that seem to be quite different, also in terms of the customers and users. And so the first use case, you have a sort of corporate setting, very, very sort of industrial environment. Then you've got an end user, someone like myself who makes an insurance claim. And then you've got someone working at the local sort of rental car dealership that is doing it in sort of I guess, commercial environment, but again, quite different. Can you leverage any of the sort of data assets that you use for any of them across these use cases? And how do you try and, I guess, make sure that you sort of learn from sort of, I guess, each product that you build and potentially improve the other products that are sort of related to it under your sort of overall product umbrella?
Yeah. So to be honest, it's like a hugely insightful question because it's something that we think about a lot. And I think it's something that we've, looking back, have made some mistakes in doing, and to sort of pick that apart a little bit. So I think that there we have the advantage of, yes, the data and the predictions and in general, let's say sort of the baseline technology is the same. Ultimately, we're talking about a car, we're talking about damage on a car, and we're talking about what do you do with that damage? And do you put the car in a certain category? Do you estimate the repair cost? And that process is sort of broadly similar across the different use cases. I think one thing, probably a mistake that we made early on in the business, is we tried to go after too many different use cases, and we were probably a bit too flexible in when we're speaking to customers and they say, oh, this would be really helpful or this would be really helpful. We let that drive our product roadmap too much, and we started to create something which it wasn't cohesive. Like, it didn't fit together. When you put it on a piece of paper and start to think, well, this attaches here and this attaches here, it started to get a bit messy. And when we recognized that, we really had to think about how do we take those commonalities between the different use cases, um, and make sure that we're building one product, or make sure we're building a constrained suite of products, and not just kind of building anything and everything. The hardest thing actually for us has been less about the products that we're building. I think we've managed to get them fairly consistent and managed to some degree not educate, but inform the different industries that actually there is a core piece that is relevant to different areas. So they don't need to have fully customized mobile applications, for example. There is a core inspection that we've now tested with thousands of inspections that is like works for these different use cases. But the hardest thing, coming back to your question, is every one of these different end users, so our customers, be that someone working in the claims team within a rental car company, be that someone working on the factory floor or at a car auction, um, or someone working in the claims or underwriting team at an insurance company, they all have their systems that they use today. They all have their tools and their workflows. And what they don't want is, they don't want a company like us coming in and saying, here's a new screen you have to have on your computer. Here's a new login you have to have. And it's not integrated with what you do today. So there's some kind of manual work. So the biggest thing for us in tackling multiple use cases and multiple sectors at the same time is we have to be really good at deciding what are the existing tools that we're going to integrate into, and how do we make sure that for the actual users of our data, we're giving them the data and the information in the context that they're used to, in the way that their work works today. And I think that's been sort of a critical, I guess, insight for us, is that has to be just as big a part of our business as building the foundational models is.
Building on that last aspect, which seems to be a really important one across pretty much any Gen AI use case, is this element of change management. You've alluded to this sort of technical integration standpoint, that we don't want to have yet another sort of traditionally it's been analytics dashboards that you create all over the place. Now we have all of these different Gen AI agents. But I guess it's also from a process, mindset, skill and training standpoint quite different, where we now get sort of likely recommendations for things, just because I guess, even though your solution, I'm sure is doing an amazing job. There is, I guess, never a sort of 100% accurate. And you mentioned this element of subjectivity, that there is a sort of range of possible recommendations and different viewpoints, even with sort of individuals, maybe especially with individuals. Probably your model is sort of much more scientifically rooted than many of these, I guess, experts. Which leads me to the question of what role does change management, so the role, the process, and sort of the upskilling of these individuals that actually use your solution look like, and what did you learn from it so far?
Yeah, so one thing you learn is there are people who are very, very open to change and are excited about it. And there are people who are adverse to change or even kind of scared of change. Or frankly, and I don't want to criticize those people because they have been doing things in a certain way and it's worked for them and it's worked for the business. So, and I'm sure through, the history of technology, there have also been plenty that have come in and they have all this promise, but the reality doesn't deliver. And so over time, over many cycles, people get more skeptical of, is this new great thing actually something that's going to help me, or is it just going to be another one of these, initiatives that gets parked at some point? So I think with that in mind, that there are different people, there are going to be people who are more excited and people who are less excited. The way you communicate why something is happening, and particularly the way that you can show individuals how it will help achieve what they want to achieve. And frankly, we're all motivated by incentives somewhere. Now, that might be that you're completely overloaded and you need something that's going to help you manage your different priorities and get your work done faster. It may be that you want something to increase your performance or your team's performance because your end of year bonus is coming up and there's going to be something tangible about if you can improve your metrics, then everyone gets to go on a nicer holiday. There's going to be all these elements of incentives, and you need to, at least what we've learned, is you need to understand what people's incentives are, and you need to sell them and prove to them how you are helping them achieve their goals. I think it's not about coming in and saying this is a mandated new thing. You must now use it because the CTO is very excited about it. It's about within the organizational structure, how do you make sure that that what you're building as a vendor, as a provider of tools and products, is helping individuals do their work better, do their work faster, achieve more, achieve their goals. So I think it's not easy, and there will be pushback, and there will be also the reality of when we talk about sort of automation and efficiency, there is obviously the impact on there are businesses who will then do more with less. And that's, no one's stupid. No one doesn't appreciate that that could be a result and has been a result through technological history. And, you know much more about this than I do, but every time there's been some iteration. I think back to sort of the spreadsheet, the spreadsheet we take for granted, but that was a big step forward in building out models, in accounting, and in all these things. The way I see Gen AI and the associated technologies is it is another step forward. There will be some change, but as long as the people that are important to you as someone who builds products, ultimately your end users, your customers, as long as they're seeing, understanding, and you're actually delivering the value to them, we found that adoption curve to be much easier to pass through.
No, that's super insightful and almost funny that empathy seems to be sort of a critical success factor as it relates to the adoption of Gen AI, which is sort of an inherent human attribute in a way. Um, what are some of the technological developments that you're particularly excited about in as it relates to your use cases and your day-to-day work?
So I think what's interesting is how some of these technologies are overlapping. So um, if you go back through the history of computer vision, ultimately what you're doing is you're taking an image and you're breaking it down into a set of numbers. You're creating some kind of matrix from that image. And without getting too technical, you have pixels, pixel being a picture element. So you've broken the image down into elements, and you can describe those pixels in a certain way. You can describe the color of those pixels, you can describe the brightness. Once you can turn it into numbers, then you can start running statistics on it. So that's sort of the foundation of computer vision. Now, what's been interesting is how that is overlapping with Gen AI. So the traditional computer vision, you have optical character recognition. So most people are familiar if you're activating a new credit card, you can take out your phone, you can scan it, it will read the numbers on it. You have license plate recognition, face detection, um, and there are just things they're so integrated now we sort of don't even think of them as being a technological leap. And what I think is interesting in relation to Gen AI is the overlap here and the way, and it's kind of fascinating when you think about it, the way a language model can be used to interpret images or to generate images. And again, without getting, too into the weeds, it's a similar process of how do you break up an image into its sort of relevant or into a useful set of components? How do you turn that into numbers? And then how do you make predictions? So with a language model, you're predicting the next token, the next word, or the next part of the sentence. With an image creation model, you're sort of predicting the next part of the image. And you're doing that by turning it into language to some degree and then interpreting that language and using it as a back and forth. But there are increasing overlaps between this. So let's take a simple example. Let's take a graph. So you have a graph and you want to put it into a Gen AI model and you want it to interpret it for you and tell you what's going on in the graph. In doing that, it will use some very traditional principles of computer vision. So it will use optical character recognition to read the axes of the graph. It will use what's called edge detection, which is looking at, if you look at a stream of pixels, when does something change? And if that changes, then there could be a line there, for example. So you have the axes and you have what's on the graph. And then you use, more traditional or modern but traditional language interpretation to try and describe what's happening in that graph. And I think so for me, that's super interesting in what we do at Raven, but also just generally how these systems are overlapping and are able to use tools from each other, like in a fairly unintuitive way. It's not an obvious leap to go from interpreting text to interpreting images, but I think it's super cool as a technologist how those things are starting to overlap and how you can start to make the connections in a way that you would do intuitively. If you were to look at a graph, you would look at the axes, you would read the axes, and then you would interpret it into language in your head to say, okay, this graph is going up and to the right, and this is about revenue growth, so this company is doing well. I think using those models of how humans understand things and interpret things and pulling from the different components of the different areas of research is super interesting. Just like for me, it's super interesting as a nerd, but also it's like interesting in the applications that it will deliver.
As a final question, bringing this conversation back to pretty much where we started talking about incumbents and some of the challenges they're facing. And you've, of course, worked across a number of different environments, cultures, organizational settings. What would be your top 3 recommendations to a chief data and AI officer at one of the automotive incumbents to unlock value from these technologies, especially around Gen AI in a sustainable way?
Mhm. So I think the first thing is don't get too excited by the hype. There's a tendency to whatever we read in the business media or in the technical media, and you just feel like you're being left behind if you're not implementing, whatever is the newest and most exciting thing that's out there. I think it comes back to the fundamentals of what are you looking to solve. So if I were chief data officer or CTO of a large organization, you have a huge amount of things that you can improve within your own organization, even before you start to think about how can this be incorporated into products. There's there's a huge amount of efficiency that these tools can bring. And the way I would always start is understanding what are the opportunities for growth or improvement, and what are the things that can be solved? What are the issues here that we have? And only then start to ask, what is the technology that's going to help me get there? And with Gen AI, with some of the other new technologies that are in development or have recently come out, there is a huge opportunity there. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the hype isn't based on something, but ultimately, I would always bring it back to business fundamentals and what problems are you trying to solve, what issues do you have, and therefore what technologies are out there, either that you can buy or you can build, that will solve those problems. So I think that's sort of an internal view. And then an external view is a similar thing, but it's more based on the understanding of the customer. What are customers excited about? What are some of their frustrations with your existing products? And are there tools and technologies that can make them better? Like, I'm sure you've thought and talked a lot about the human machine interface within a car. There are opportunities to improve how you control, how you personalize, how you do everything within a car. Now, the question is that one of the most burning priorities for the customers? Will it ultimately make them buy more cars or spend more on your cars? And are the technologies out there fit for purpose? And are they at a level where it makes sense to incorporate them? And I think, yeah, so it would be going back to the fundamentals, understanding what are the jobs to be done in the different contexts, either internally or externally, and then what are the tools that are available, and are they, and think of them like tools. Don't think of them like magic. Don't think of them like something that's going to completely revolutionize everything. Think of them as products, as services, as features, and are they going to improve what you need to be improved today? So that's the way I think about it.
Neil, thank you so much. I love the clarity and criticality of your thinking and learned so much from you today and really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Varun. Yeah, it was great to chat.